Good morning, and welcome to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. How's everybody doing? Figured since we're all looking at different directions, I should just look away. Oh, hello. Welcome to the podcast.
We should always do that. Like, how you doing? Like, just came randomly in.
Oh, hey, hi. Welcome to the podcast. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. How were the weekends, gentlemen? Hope they were relaxing. Kind of.
It went quick.
Chill time.
I could start using longer weekends. If we could have that weekend stretcher, that would be good. It just goes by too quick these days.
Well, it's very interesting how we went from, what was it, in the Midwest, we went from like 65 degrees.
Yes.
A little chilly on one of the evenings. We had a bonfire. And then the next day it was like, okay, cool, 95. Quite the jump.
Yeah, I missed that opportunity. My son on the cold day loves fires in the backyard. Hey, Dad, can we have a fire? It's getting a little late, but we'll just have one tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes around, we're like,
no fire.
We're
not going to do it in 90-degree heat. Too much heat.
The backyard's on fire. So
that's funny.
This is true.
Anything you guys kind of seen it come across your radar this week around interesting articles or things that are kind of coming across the community?
Well, on this Happy Tuesday,
there it is.
I did come across an article by our good buddy Phil Seamark. Wrote up a blog. Should paste this in the chat while I'm talking about it. He had a use case where apparently some organizations can't download third-party tools, which kind of creates a conundrum where we talk about how do you interact with large models or models in the cloud, and our go-to is the tabular editor. But with things like calculation groups, one of the only ways to do that is through tabular editor. So he came up with a solution with a few counterparts where putting together his DAX mastery along with some C# and PowerShell and understanding the back ends of models, put together a PowerShell script that allows you to communicate and create calculation groups in your local model.
Yeah.
And it looks pretty deep because it's not just the calculation group. It looks like a framework for interacting with almost all the pieces of the AS model on your local host. So definitely worth a dive into for sure. I love it when Phil puts the pen to the paper and shares a bit of his knowledge, but he's definitely delivering on this one. This one's cool. So if you're stuck and wanting to use calculation groups, this would be a way you could do that without tabular editor.
And it's we are talking pure PowerShell on top of this one.
Yeah, that's the only downside, right? Is you're gonna turn off. This isn't your business, folks. But I mean, in general, do they even know calculation groups exist? Probably not.
Yeah,
true.
Right.
And
so
this is also something that I find a very interesting conversation in general. When I look at this kind of, this is a solution being born out of a problem. We talk a lot about the podcast about people who are lazy. This is not a lazy solution by any means. However, this is a 100% workaround to when someone doesn't give you the tools that you need. 100%. So this is I think a problem I have a lot with potential companies that, yes, I understand that you have policies. I understand that you are not allowed to install external things, but Microsoft themselves, I mean, there's a couple points here, right? One point is some companies will say, well, if Microsoft doesn't build it, it's not a real tool. We're never going to use it. Period. End of story. Full stop. And I feel like that's just a miss, because then you get stuff like this showing up where your employees want to use calculation groups. They find a use case for it, need to get into it. And so what happens in Excel when you get data, you don't have access to the database. So you export everything to Excel and then take it from there and build your own database and Access or whatever. This is what happens. The business finds a way to make the thing work, even without the right tools. It finds a way. So, I mean, if people want to use it, there's usually a way of getting around it. So this is a very interesting article. Again,
the lazy analogy, this is the same thing as someone not wanting to take out the trash. So they engineer a button to press that moves it across the driveway.
Yes.
This is
the Rube Goldberg machine of calculation group.
Yeah. Well, honestly, though, I'm glad you kind of have to rely on PowerShell, but I feel like in this space, even if if you're on the cusp of just being a business user and then starting to get more, call it developer, but you're gonna get introduced to PowerShell in the Microsoft world.
Yes.
Like that's my track where I knew no other code besides SQL, you know, DAX and Power Query,
Hmm.
Excel, and then APIs. All of a sudden, you're looking at PowerShell. All of a sudden, you download VS Code. What is this? And then it's a very fast track because all the APIs for the audit log, the activity, a lot of them do require PowerShell, or that's the best medium to do so.
Mhm.
Now, to actually do what Phil's done, that's insane.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Deep levels of understanding of both tool set, like all the tool
Yeah.
sets, right? But I think there's a balancing act though, Mike, right? When we talk about features and functionality and the ability to do certain things, I think I agree with you on one end because it's like, okay, we have a PowerShell solution and a third-party tool.
Yep.
And there's not really an interface that you would assume if you had something that an AS model supported, you would have an easier access way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where, like, the interesting question for me is where does that fit into your UI should just support this as part of the UI versus this would be a new a larger feature that would have to be supported, right? Because the argument of like, oh well, if we offer up this capability or leave this capability open because it was there for enterprise scenarios or hardcore developers and they have access to it, that's good enough versus time and effort to build it into the tool for the benefit of question mark, right? Because there's a balance
Yes.
between how much I would imagine the team would wants to engineer and build something in and then have to support. And if you think about like I think we've said this a lot, like there's a bunch of kind of workaround features that we can have access to and use, but maybe it's just not worth this. The juice isn't worth the squeeze to build it into certain things, or maybe it's just further down the roadmap. I don't know. That's where my head goes.
But they don't have to create the actual back end. It's really just creating the front end.
So this is
I know.
Yeah.
this
I
is
know,
I agree with Tommy on this one. I think there's a disconnect between like they're holding to a standard of something that you can use, but there was never enough interest. I don't know, value that required that
No,
the front end
that's
team
insane.
said, "Hey, let's build a UI that helps you create a calculation group or let you do that through desktop." And I don't know.
Well, think about how
Dang
much
it,
time
data
it takes to
marts,
field
you got in the
parameters.
way of this, right? Like
Probably,
go
I
ahead.
don't know.
Yeah.
There's only so much work you can do.
This is not the ultimate excuse. Well, I mean, we were planning on doing it, but someone's
Yeah,
the data
yeah.
marts and
It
what
feels
you want us to do.
and again, I think a lot of these what you find here is particularly in the development of Power BI Desktop. I think what you're seeing is the analysis services engine has to always stay one or two steps ahead of anything that's happening in desktop. Because if you're going to utilize anything new, calculation, metric wise, right? The problem first has to present itself as here's what we're going to try to enhance DAX or the analysis service engine first.
Yeah.
Once that thing gets up and running, then the UI can come behind it and say, okay, desktop. Now, I don't think I ever really put those two pieces together, like how totally coupled those two development areas are. You just can't go build something in the front end unless it's strongly supported in the back end.
Well, think of the coding for field parameters. That's not like a supported thing in the analysis services. Like they not only had to create obviously the UI, but they had to make it work.
Field parameters is a
So
little bit more different, though, I believe.
yeah, but it's still there's a functionality there that did not
True.
exist in the system that now exists. Calculation groups exist in the code, so to speak. It's in part of the skeleton.
Yes, and I think that's one of the key differences I think between field parameters and calculation groups, because calculations groups are part of the model. It's a model-based
Right.
solution,
So it should be theoretically
buildable inside,
buildable. Yeah.
yeah, inside in
Yeah,
the
if you need
UI.
someone to build it, it's not
Yeah,
me.
no, not buildable. That's what everyone's doing for the
It should be
PowerShell
billable.
script.
Yeah, well, it is, man. It's
really all is.
Anyways, good article, very well articulated. The code, by the way, his PowerShell script, very well documented. Lots of comments, very easy to follow, and I find it fascinating. So this is kind of also I want to put a flavor on here. This is how Phil Seamark does things. Phil Seamark figures out something very niche like this very niche thing. What you're seeing in here, though, when you read through the script, you're seeing him create there's a whole bunch of like little pound signs for model.tables.remove or model.tables and then creating uh, a a table name there, or calculation group.precedence or calculation group.description. This is stuff that's been existing. It's been around. It's in the background. It's using a library, the Microsoft Analysis Services calculations group library. When it does all this stuff, this now opens the door for anyone to create automation through PowerShell using measures or tables or like so. Just this example, I think, will spawn off a number of other creative people in the community. If you are a creative person in the community, go take a look at this article that we put in the links here, because this could be technically used to automate a lot of other things around models. If you have a consistent model that you need to, regularly add the same amount of code, or if you have a lot of data models you're going to repeatedly use over and over again, this is a technique you could use to automate the creation of many model pieces.
Yeah.
So, or go research them, right? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how this goes.
This is still my quest for like some VS Code for like C# and the tablet editor mix until sent. But last bit on this, Mike, you always speak to this, but this is a perfect article for a perfect example of the necessity that comes from the greatest tidbits that we learn. The best articles are things from necessity. No one just randomly thinks of an article like, I'm going to write about creating
it's solving a
measures
problem.
of power. Yeah.
Yes.
And they don't have a content schedule of all the like amazing things they're going to figure out. It's they have a situation, they run into it, they go, wow. And for anyone who's out there who's listening, and if you're running these situations, you always say this, write it down. You don't necessarily have to write a blog article, but just document what you did. If anything, it's your own catalog of how did I do that? So
dig it. This is good. So anyways, good article, very cool stuff. And let's maybe transition to our topic for today. So moving away from the technical PowerShell, we will move into another
to the ambiguous and gray.
Yeah, we're going to move into something that's very squishy and not well defined at all. Let's talk about what's going on with data quality. How do you build, generate, create quality of data, and how do you get people to kind of trust it? This is a very interesting topic. I think Microsoft has got some good documentation around this, and this is a topic kind of out of the Power BI adoption roadmap a little bit here, and I'll put the link here in both the YouTube and the LinkedIn area, so we can kind of follow along if you want to read along the article. This one, we're going to maybe start talking a little bit about data culture and how that is affected, and how do we use our data and create trust around it. Tom, you want to give us some more introduction?
Yeah, so I might have a slightly different take, but in the same vein, this is a very loosely based part of data culture, but nonetheless, still, I think a very strong thing. Because we've said multiple times on the podcast, trust and data culture.
Yes,
like trust is an essential part, and I think one of the conversations we were having offline, it was very much so on. Okay, well, we always talk about trust and we're in data. So is there a way to, in a sense, combine the two? If you're doing a lot of things in your company to, let's say, build a data culture, is there a way to sense measure that, to actually say we've done a better job now with data culture and the way people trust the data, trust the BI team, trust the process than they did before? And one, is that even possible? And two, is this something part worth our time? Then the other part of that is that data quality. Is there a way to really show in what we do, a way to show progress? And it's not just saying measuring like always at 90%, but that we're doing better than we were at a previous time.
Yep. And so this is a I think this will really depend on your perspective on what is data quality and how do you quantify that, because I think there's a number of metrics you could put in place that help you define what data quality is. I've built a number of reports in the past that actually do like a data quality dashboard, and I've explained this to what I think to people at some level. I think there's in certain industries there is more tolerance for not always correct data, like with a little bit of fluff in data, just because of the volume. So let me paint you some picture here. Let me throw some colors, some texture around this, right? As you create more data, or as you have more data, the amount of effort it takes to keep it clean, I think, increases. And so I like to think of this as, in my math mind, I like to think of this as like an asymptotic curve, where it increasingly gets more expensive the closer you get to 100% clean data all the time. And so I think in some industries, like talking about the banking industry, there's not going to be a lot of tolerance for not 100%. I have all my transactions in my bank account because people are losing. Like you don't want to lose people's money. So there's a lot of effort and work and money spent to make sure that those numbers are like spot on, 100% correct, very accurate. Lots of double checks going on. But in other areas, like if you're doing master data management, there's maybe many different owners of that information, and many people own different properties, or engineering owns a portion of that data, marketing owns a portion of that data, maybe the pricing of that information comes from the finance team, right? There's different owners of master data, and how do you quantify whether that data is correct? Do you make I've made a dashboard around data before in the past, showing the different quality of data. What's the threshold? When do we stop doing our day jobs and work on increasing the quality of the data for people to trust it? So I think being transparent about what is the data, making rules about your data, and then being able to measure those rules against the data itself helps increase the quality of the data, or that trust in the data.
I agree with those points. I guess where my thought processes are this morning are kind of peeling like the baseline,
Yeah.
which correlate to a lot of what you're talking about. And then I think I was reading an article actually on public relations, which I'll chime in here because I think there's a lot of crossover in the conversation. But
Yeah.
To me, there were a couple areas that fall into different buckets for me.
Sure.
That you were talking about. I think transparency for sure is like the first part, right? Like within an organization, in your data ingestion, modeling, reporting, people just need to understand, at least on a high level, how things work, right?
Agreed.
When you're saying something broke down somewhere, does that mean anything to people?
Yep.
Right? Like,
Yep.
is there something that they can grasp as far as like, well, it's just not in the report, above and beyond like all of the different pieces of engineering that have to happen to create information for them?
Yeah.
So I think transparency in that generic process is a starting point. You were talking a lot about data quality, right? And that to me is like, are you thorough, right? Are you thorough in your processes to ensure that the quality of the data is high, that people have confidence in the numbers, whether it's benchmarked
Yes.
against a known business logic piece
Yes.
or a core piece of data that
Correct.
comes from somewhere, etc.
But I think it's being like it's even more, like I want to hang on that point there you make right there, because I like what you said about that, and I think it's more about we've clearly articulated here's what data quality means, and here are some of the rules that apply to these data quality fields or these data quality things, right? Products can be one of these three types. We have, these are the kind of colors that it can be. It's not this, because what happens is people put in any kind of old data into any field, and then data gets weird, and then you're like, well, why doesn't this match? Or I thought so and so owned this data. Like, so I think there's this level of like defining what the rules are, communicating the rules, and then showing the results of those rules being applied against the data. I think is a very important thing.
Before you jump in,
sorry.
Right? When I say baseline, what I'm in transparency, thoroughness,
Yep.
I'm saying like these are expectations, almost, right? Like, so this to me is setting the stage for where I think we go with the conversation. Like, how do you build on that? How do you measure that? Are you doing this effectively with the organization, whatever? But part of this also is timely. Like, are you getting, there are so many different data needs. Are you putting data in a report when people want to see it, right? And if you spend enough time in the full ecosystem, as opposed to having a whole group of engineers that surface up data and you just plug into it, right? Which would be, boy, that would be fun, as opposed to managing large volumes of data through pipelines, being responsible and understand that, like, okay, here's all of these processes have to work even before your pretty report and model refresh, right?
Totally. Yeah.
In order to ensure that your internal or external customers are getting the information they want, and then tracking it, right? Like, in these level set expectations as a baseline, these are like this is what a data team, reporting engineer, whatever analytics team is responsible for.
Yeah.
Are you trending in the right direction with all of these things, right? Like, is your team getting better over time? You're going to have different challenge points depending on your data sets, right? You're going to
Sure.
spend a lot more time in certain areas. But I think some of each one is equally important, because if you don't have at least the baseline expectations and understanding set through the organization, where maybe this is the transparency of our process and what we're supposed to be doing for you as a part of the organization, this is like the starting point for how we engage with the business in terms of building trust.
So you're gonna see a workshop in action right now, because I love where this is going. Um, just a few quick bits from what you guys said, because I'm gonna rewind this, because what you guys the dialogue you just had is gold, gentlemen, in terms of just
I'm done
very.
here. 30-minute podcast.
We're not a
Done.
half
No,
hour in yet.
we're
No,
not even. Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
I'm-
let's take a
Whoa,
10-minute break. Get some coffee.
if I'm hitting it right now, dude, I'm gonna blow your mind later, right?
Wait till the coffee
I'm gonna
kicks
start
in.
paying you in 20 minutes. Yeah, if that's the case.
That was just that was a freebie right there.
Well, so the one thing that you said, and I'm going to have to discover this more, is you said public relations and trust. That's a great analogy that I think really deserves some more discovery. I actually was looking to do PR when I first graduated college, and just kind of discover and looking into different professions. That's a really good analogy in terms of where do you start in terms of measuring trust. Mike, you said quality is you basically said just so many words that data quality and trust. Would you consider them the same thing?
So no, I don't actually.
Yep.
So I think data quality is indicators of how well your data meets a set of rules. Data quality, right? So
Okay.
I've
Yeah.
got, the description is this length. This product has these length with height dimensions filled out properly, right? It's the quality, like there is data present in those fields, right? Someone's not just arbitrarily putting in whatever they like. The pricing has
Right.
been updated and accurate for that particular product to make whatever that thing is, right? So that is quality, right? So that you define rules, and I think there's to me there's a whole lot of technical jargon or pieces around like that you could get into this, right? If you think about, again, I've done a lot of work with master data before, and master data information, that is really important because many different people own what master data is to a particular product. When I worked at Johnson Controls, in there we had a really strong process around our battery and master data information about batteries. But there were many different teams that owned parts of that information that they had to update, or like we had to rigorously check it. And if things were not filled out or missing, or if someone found a problem, like that doesn't seem right, let me go check the actual dimensions of the product. Yeah, that doesn't match, or whatever. Someone's got to tap somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, look, I found this issue. Someone has to go update it. So there has to be kind of a process around that. And that to me speaks to quality, right? So we literally built a dashboard that said, here are some metrics, numbers, percentages. We ran numbers on every row of data. And after those metrics were completed, we said, okay, here's the quality of data, 85, 95%, 100%, whatever those quality metrics are. Because I feel like at some point in time, it's very difficult to keep data 100% clean all the time, and especially across multiple teams. So at some point, you have to say, stop your day job. We have a data quality problem. We need to go spend effort fixing some things, cleaning some data, making it better. And then from that, it will then increase our scores. And so we have this minimum threshold. And the business has to define what that is, right? We're acceptable. We can have a 95% data quality score. And that's something that's very measurable. It could be put in people's goals. It's something that applies to the business, right? Better data quality means you can do better things with your data.
It's like the floor of the house of trust, but it's not trust itself. It's an element.
I think it adds to that conversation we had earlier. It adds to the transparency of where the data is coming from, right? Or how does it get there, right?
Yeah.
Because you could just blind trust the data. And so I know another gentleman a friend of mine who worked at a brewery, and they had a master data warehouse. And they had this policy that was any data that's in the data warehouse that they were pulling from, that was truth. Doesn't matter what you got to. even if those numbers were wrong, you had to use it. That's how they made decisions. So the culture of that department was their team. They had an entire team dedicated to make sure those numbers were correct, updated, accurate, and were providing real results around the quality of that data. So there was so I think this also too, right? If your company says, hey, there's a team of people sitting on this data set and that is their job, right? If you have a question, ask it to that team. They'll dig around and find the answer and correct it if it's a problem.
Right.
So I think there's like a formalized process here too around like you can inquiry about questions about the data, but there's a dedicated team that owns the quality of those things. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, like, I mean, everything you're speaking to, I agree with. And two, give me the address to the brewery because I'm gonna drive there today. Data and beer, my goodness. I mean, so that's a perfect combination for
You
this
had me at
podcast.
you had me at beer.
You're telling me they measure everything with Power BI to get their beer formula? I'm there. So,
Yeah,
well, no,
done.
but everything you're talking about is I agree with, but to the extent that that's data quality, but that's not necessarily measuring trust. Trust,
Yes.
right?
So
And
the trust part of this other half of this story is how do you let people know? Like, so again, I was thinking when Seth was talking earlier around trust, the trust portion of this. There's trust in many different layers of data, right? There's the guy who's doing data in his internal department, right? So there's like the self-service BI trusted things because again, I've worked in small departments as well as at the company-wide analytics department piece of this, and you find both scenarios inside that 1 or 2 person team. Someone gives you a task, you're taking data, you're manipulating the data, you're building a data model at some level, and you're presenting results back to people. People are trusting you based on like your past history. They ask questions, they verify that what you're saying is true, right? There's an analysis that's being done, and that authority of that information comes from someone, and so people can trust you based on what you've produced historically, or see the analysis that you're doing and can trust that information. But that's at a personal BI level, and then you go all up to like a corporate level. Like, how do you instill trust at the corporate level of BI? Like, I think there's many. I think Power BI has introduced another problem here that
I think this is a complex situation.
That is new because now we're talking personal BI and corporate BI, and I think all through that you have to figure out how to handle trust.
Are you trying to? So you're saying you're trying to develop trust with yourself?
Well, I think it handles in much smaller circles, right? I think you have this small circle of like there's hub and spoke approach, right? Someone's out on the spoke, they're in their department, they're their Excel guru guy, right? They trust them to make solutions. So they're making solutions in their department or for a couple people. That's like a personal BI type thing. And then you could go all the way up to like, okay, now we have corporate data coming in at high levels for the entire organization, supply chain or whatever. That is a much larger data set, but touches many more people. So where does people manage that?
Right. So in a declarative way, you're answering you're answering already what my first question would be, which is who are we trying to build trust with?
I think it changes depending on what totally agree. There's many people.
Is there a generic, or is it like you're going to, does it change with different levels? You talked about corporate C-level, like individuals. Does it really change a lot, or is it we're trying to develop trust with our stakeholders of our reports, like the consumers?
I think that's the most important.
Can I genericize to that, or is there nuance when you're talking about who the audience is?
I think the techniques change depending on the size of the audience. I think in small audiences, I don't think you need as much rigor around the trust of the information in the data. I think you rely more on the person who's developing their reputation of keeping things clean and making good data decisions, right? It's kind of like your personal record or brand is on top of that.
So you just jumped into a different realm that I want to clarify for myself.
Sure.
When I'm thinking of measuring trust, it's with an external stakeholder, someone who's consuming a report. You backed into that with how we would establish trust, right? Or like either we have a process and definitions and a bunch of things that the organization as a whole could lean on to
Yes.
fact check
Yep.
versus smaller guy. Like I just trust Mike because Mike knows what he's doing.
Well, I think you hire.
Either way though,
Yep.
I don't. Does that change the outcome?
I don't think the outcome is different, but I think the techniques you use are different there. Because I think
Okay.
I don't think I would require, like, let's say I'm a director of a team, right? If I have a director of a team, I've hired an individual to do some analysis for me, and we're using internally to our department, something that he's producing. I would have him do some rigor around whatever that, or he or she, around whatever that their building thing is, whatever that person's building. Make some rigor around those data elements, and once it's vetted and it's working for us, we trust it. It's part of, like, we've done the vetting internally. I don't think you need to have like this whole, like, extra process around, well, let's put the data quality metric dashboard for Mike's Excel sheet, or we don't need to go through this whole, well, here's the data lineage, here's all the different steps this data touches. Oh, here's the SQL scripts or the views or whatever that are pulling the data. Like, I don't think you have to just display that.
Yeah, I think
It's not where I'm driving.
It's a little in the weeds where I'll take a brief step back. And when we say trust, what are the elements of trust? Not necessarily in the data context, but just trust in general. And then what's the like, what would be the goal, like the actual fruit of like increasing the trust? I think we need, to me, that's where I'm kind of starting with, okay, what does trust mean, or what are the elements of it? And then we can measure I would measure those subsets. But let me ask.
Let's
Yeah.
start in my mind. Start generically at the front, right? Maybe we should have started the conversation with this, right? What does it look like for an end user, that would come out of analyzing a report or reporting and have zero trust in it, right? Like
Well, yeah.
whether it's raw data or calculations or whatever, they know their business, and what you're producing for them is not accurate. They don't care how it's not accurate. They don't care about any of the inner workings. They just know it's not right. Right? Is that the definition of, like, and they're not going to come back to the report because the last 5 times they've come back, it's still wrong and they can't run their business off it. Versus
yeah. Okay.
the opposite of that, where somebody doesn't even think about that because they just know Mike's reports are awesome and everything that they need to go make a decision is spot on and it's accurate. And whenever they need to go look at it or make decisions off it, they can rely on the data accuracy and everything presented in that report as truth, right? So, like, how do we get to these different spectrums? I think is where this conversation is like, how do you establish one of those versus the other, and or how do you get away from somebody who walked away from using your report?
So I think the other part of this that is not like, I agree with that. That's the data, the accuracy part of this. But I think there's a whole other part when the trust in the org, in the BI team, or at least what they deliver, is also, is the person I'm dealing with consistent themselves, where I can rely on them for support when I need it. And I think that's another big part of this, and that I'm also satisfied. I'm satisfied with the results, not just that the data is accurate, but if I go to them, I will consistently be delivered a solution that's going to help me. I think those are the other parts. When we say trust, it's not just the accuracy. And I would say those 3 elements, like the same way and I'm going to equate it this way because I think that it's a very unique way, but like the way I trust my life, I know if I call her kind of thing to pick up something, she's probably going to do this. I can trust her. She's truthful and honest. And I think that's part of the accuracy of the data. And it's also, and again, there's that consistent. It's not like one day she's helping the kids. The other day, she's like, I'm leaving for 3 days. Like, I know what to expect on all aspects. And I think that's part of expectation. So yeah, I don't think we could just say the data accuracy part as the sole piece of the trust here.
I think, I mean, at some level, right? And then this is where I think things get a little bit more tricky, right? If you have something to measure against, it makes it much easier for individuals to measure the trust in your data, right? So if you say your department sold $2 million of product, and they have another system that says, oh, it's 2.5 million. Where's the discrepancy? Why is there a difference, right? There's going to be like this gap between their expectation and what they actually see in their information. And I think if they can't resolve that gap, then you start having trust issues. Like I think other things I think that would erode your trust, right? So this trust is gained. What is it? What is trust is earned, not gained, or something like that? I don't remember. There's a phrase there, but like, um, it takes
Earn not given. I don't know.
I don't know. It's something along the lines of like you have to like be like it's, to me, if I'm building things or that need to be trustworthy, it has to be consistent, right? So this report should be updating daily. It should work daily. It should always be there, right? If we go into the report and say, hey, I don't see data for the last 3 days, and the report's been failing for 3 days behind the scenes, to me that you're starting to erode away some of that trust. They're like, okay, I have to keep reaching out to Tommy or Mike to keep updating whatever's going on to make sure this is working. So I think that's part of that is there's like this concept of like an SLA around the data. And this is where I think there are different scales of this, depending if this is personal BI for like a department, a small thing versus a corporate larger thing, right? And I was in departments where we had an IT department building data things for us. And what we would go in is we would test that data against something else that was known. And if the two things didn't match, we started having trust issues. Like, this doesn't make sense.
Sure.
And so I think you start, like, I think the idea here is you can kind of come into this with a little bit of blind trust and say, okay, I'm going to trust this data until I see other things that tell me it is not accurate. There's things that are going to erode my trust. And I think you start in that position. And then after a certain point in time, the reputation of that department, whatever that is, the person, department, whatever, at some point you get to a point where I can't trust this data anymore. I have to do all my own analysis because you've had enough of these occurrences where data's not being refreshed. The data I'm looking at doesn't match what I think it should be doing. The numbers are inconsistent from month to month. Like if I keep pulling the same data table every month and the old historical numbers are updating or changing, why? Tell me why.
Right.
So I think there's this whole kind of concept of like more transparency from the data generation team into the people consuming the data. Oh, wait a minute, we had a I'm much more forgiving to the data quality or trusting it if they say, hey, this data broke down. We had a load issue. We're working on resolving it. The numbers are going to be in like, so to me, that transparency we talked about earlier is very relevant for instilling trust into people. And then when there are problems with the data, it doesn't make sense. This number doesn't look right. I could totally be interpreting the data incorrectly, and it actually is right. But I need to be able to have confidence that asking someone, in the data space, hey, this is what I see that looks wrong. Can you help me get to the bottom of this? Help me understand why this data seems incorrect. And when they go into it, oh yeah, no problem. This is what happened. The master data was misaligned appropriately. And so we were putting your sales data into the wrong region because of XYZ thing. It was a data quality issue. We can now resolve that and the numbers come back. Oh, okay, I understand. I think that's like a trust thing, right?
I think everything at some point, right, come from a consumer's perspective, data quality is an umbrella term for all of the things that can go wrong in
Yes.
terms of an expectation.
I agree.
Right.
Tommy, I'm gonna avoid the thing you brought up. I don't.
Okay.
I don't. To me, this conversation is squarely in where we set it from the baseline, which
Okay.
is there's a lot of data movement and different things that we do to present something in reporting. What you outlined is, can I trust or can I have expectations about the delivery of a team in an organization? And to me,
So,
that's a separate.
okay, for context, I'm thinking in my head, if you were to give everyone at the company a 1 to 10, do I trust BI? What would move that needle? And
Do you
that's
I like that.
trust BI?
do you trust the business intelligence team or the business intelligence at our company?
Okay, so like now we're talking about like how do we start to measure things?
Right.
Sure.
And maybe that's too far ahead right now, but that's why I brought up what I did, because I think data quality is, and what everything we're talking about is it's a part of that, but it's not the whole cake. So
Well,
yeah, maybe,
ultimately, there's a team, right?
yeah.
Is responsible for those things that we've talked about. 100% agree with that,
So
right? So
yeah,
if you want to equate that to the point you made,
yeah.
okay, I'm on board.
And if it's out of the circle, that's I'll concede that. But like I said, I'm trying to go through all the parts because there's a face to it too, and I think that's like anyone who's dealing with BI at some point knows the people who's on BI. I don't. It's harder to get trust if you don't know who the heck's doing it. Like if you just randomly get a report, I think it's a lot harder if you don't have some representative, someone. You don't just trust data, you also trust people. And that's a huge component of this. That's a huge part of the data culture too, or at least the whole documentation is the people involved. So that's where I'm coming from, that angle. But maybe we take that for another episode.
So I'm gonna make some points that are specific to after you start collecting information on like
Mhm.
what is the baseline of trust within your organization. And I pasted in chat where
Yeah.
I was doing some research on like, hey, different things to talk about related to this topic. And unironically, right, that's where this public relations, one popped up, even though it doesn't relate to data. I think there's so many correlations between
Mhm.
like how, this massive group of people decided or thin down the streamlined 6 points of how do you establish trust in public relations, right? And some of those key tenets are, right? So let's say we understand what the organizational level of trust is within our data, within our baseline. We set that transparency. They know what they can expect. They know kind of how our process works or what they can expect from our team.
Mhm.
But coming out of that, I think it's important where you have to start to set the goals and objectives for. I think the context here is you don't have the innate trust of your organization,
Mhm.
right? So
I would agree with that.
what are those short, medium, and long term goals that you can start to set as the body team, the people responsible for this, to start to move in a direction that is going to start to establish trust within the organization, right? Establishing benchmarks. Like Mike, you said before,
Mhm.
like there's a warehouse, there's a core data that everybody just knows everything that's coming out of here is fully vetted, right? It's gone through a series of data quality checks of
Sure.
people looking at it and
Yeah.
analyzing,
And
and
I can ask
we
questions
know
against
that
it,
this
and
is
someone
good,
answers the questions
right?
around what our
Right.
problems are.
In
Like, why is
Power
this
It's the
wrong?
BI,
Yeah.
foundation.
Hmm.
in Power BI, this can be the elevated data sets or reports, right?
Certified.
They get certification levels that allow to
Hmm?
establish like if you see something with this certification level and it's wrong, we will correct it with it like right
Correct.
away.
It's SLA.
But
Applying
Mhm.
applying an
but
SLA
then
to
you
those things.
you set a tier, right? A first tier of, hey, I may not have trust in the generic reports, but I know that this certification, I've never had a problem with it, right? So you're setting that first benchmark and like maybe pushing and leaning into defining what the logic definitions are,
Hmm?
right? Uh, what is the scope of the report so that people have the quick go-tos for the conversation, right? So often it's, I'm looking at this report, I think it should do this. Well, what is the baseline? What's the benchmark? What should it be doing? I think
Yes.
is so much part of the conversation that's missed, and where you get into these loops of confusion because you don't have that starting point for some of the core data things that we're talking about. So it's deciding upon those metrics, right? Like what are the activity metrics? What is the general attitude as I'm moving, you know, these things into the organization or trying to improve that trust, and what are the outcomes of each of those, sorts of metrics that I've defined are important based on all of the feedback that I'm getting from the organization. And then the other two are like, what is the measurement methodology, right? Like within your team, how do you measure that you're succeeding, right? How are you increasing satisfaction? And we can do that by whatever that input is to receive the feedback. How are you measuring that compared to the outgoing feedback? Like after you made the changes, is that changing the sentiment of the company or the people that are engaging with your reports? And I think the outcome of trusting those data, or trusting the data and having people more consume reports and believe that your team is producing things on time, accurate, etc., are you would expect that that sentiment would increase, or you define those metrics where you'd have a deliverable outcome that's beneficial to your team and the company. And then ultimately, like, cycling on this process, right? And that's where I think it fits into the data culture thing, because within that is this component of making sure that people trust the data that's coming out of reporting, because it's the core tenet of quality, right? That umbrella term of all of these things that are going on that are going to move the needle, right? If there is solid trust in the data, then your 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 army of analysts are going to be doing heavy analysis and making decisions for the company that's going to impact the company,
Hmm?
right? And the higher the quality of data, the better those decisions and the faster those
Exactly
decisions
right.
are made. And then you're just iterating on that process. So it might be, to Mike's point, multiple different takeaways or actions for each part of that data culture ecosystem, the larger you grow that. Or it
Hmm?
could just be a mental note for Mike because he's the guy, right? But
Exactly.
ultimately,
Yep.
you're starting to measure something that should be, I think maybe this is the BI team should set their own level of expectation, in that trust and satisfaction of the output is a paramount KPI that they need to be plugged into, like, right away.
And I think the article you sent out said there's like a couple different areas here. Trust is a fluid mechanism. It kind of talked about it is the idea that it's talked about a little bit what is trust. And there's a couple areas here. It's multi-level, and one I want to point out here, um it's dynamic. Trust is constantly changing. It's either it cycles through phases of building trust, destabilizing trust, and dissolving trust. So it to me it feels like what we were kind of saying earlier was trust is always going somewhere. It's whether that trust is increasing in whatever you're doing for your data set, and what are the processes you put in place to increase that level of trust, and what are how are you and then when things go wrong, right? The data set doesn't refresh. I asked a question and never got answered. Like these, now you start dissolving that bucket of trust away from whatever that thing is. And so I think this becomes very much a challenge for organizations because I can't have all data be trusted or have high qualities of trust or high levels of trust across all data unless your team is massive. So you're going to have to pick and choose. Like this is one of these, there's not enough time or money to make everything perfect. So this is where I think executive sponsors come into play here and say, what is the most important things for us? What are the key data sets that we need to be focusing on to make sure there is a high quality of trust around that topic of data, and then communicating that. And I think you made a good point here. I think you should survey it. I think what Tommy does at his company is a great idea. Do you trust this data set? Do you trust what's coming out of the BI team? Be very specific. What can we like? What about this data set is making you not trust it? What can I do to improve that trust? Because it's going to ebb and flow.
So I've been writing a few words down throughout this conversation, and Seth, you solidified some of the words already. So I'm a terrible drawer, but imagine, I think something I've written down that you can really, I think, then begin to break down to how to measure, or at least measure trust in this context. Where if you had a flat line that was trust and 4 pillars underneath it, I have delivery, communications, response, and satisfaction. Underneath that is your full wall or floor of data quality. Because if you don't have data quality, none of this matters. But you can, in my head, like I said, I've written these words down multiple times already. You can measure delivery, your ability to respond, do either with your tickets or
Tickets.
projects.
Yep.
Communication is something you can measure, where how are you communicating to the company on your reports, your office hours? Are you doing those things to at least put the word out? Response, when things do break, when the data quality is wrong, what is our time to respond to our response pattern? Another thing that can be measured. And satisfaction through the surveys. Seth, you literally just spoke to all this, and I've already, like I said, these have been very constant words throughout this. And then finally, the data quality, like all these pieces put together trust. It's not just one survey that says trust, but all these pieces, I think, go into can we actually see where the trust is at the company?
I would put data quality in the communication side.
Hmm.
I mean, I would definitely say. I mean, it is an output of something you communicate back to the audience about the quality of that information. Like just the fact that you're measuring
Right.
quality of data at some degree, I think its
Right.
core instills some level of trust. It doesn't have to be
But
super comprehensive.
I hear what Tommy said is that's the baseline.
That's the
Data
foundation.
quality is the baseline. Like
I'm not going to be so
All the
naive.
pillars are underneath.
I'm not going to be so
it, or
naive
on
to
top.
think that every single data set everyone produces is going to
No.
have a data quality report with it.
But
Or
if you have,
Yeah, but I guess
that's not
what
what
I'm
I'm saying.
thinking. I guess what I'm
Yeah.
thinking. Like I'm not talking about personally shared stuff or uncontrolled data sets, or like I'm talking about reporting that's shared widely within the organization that has a bunch of consumers.
Right.
But I would
And if you
also
have
agree
consistently
though,
bad
like
data,
but I
it
would
doesn't
also agree
matter
that
anything else.
in those levels though, even at the corporate level, I have observed very high profile trust. You know, we need to trust this data to make decisions. No quality reporting on top of it. There's nothing. There's no
Oh,
indication
you're
of that.
saying so that would be a delivery thing.
It's totally a delivery thing.
You're saying part of delivery should include a quality check that people can do against the data sets,
or at least communication that you are quality checking certain things. Here's again, it's that concept of like, if I'm going to give people the ability to trust our information, to say here's the rules that we define that tell us if this data is good or not. These are the rules where we tell you what the rules are, and then we score ourselves against those rules. And when those numbers dip below a certain value, someone's allowed to raise their hand and say, hey, the quality on this field or this information it's below 75%. Is that what we want? And then
so your argument here would be that data quality in some form, whether that's you have a bunch of validation against values of information or monitoring of delivery, right? Like of the pipelines or whatever. Like having that available along with part of your solution should be a core part of delivery. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
You need to have the business be able to function on its own without having to ping somebody in the BI team.
Totally agree with that. Again, it's part of that self-service piece of this thing. Yeah, here, James asks a really good question on this. James, I'm going to give you a link here of something that this is not exactly what I was thinking, but this is close enough that I think it'll at least communicate some stuff here. There are some basic metrics you could just throw at people, like, hey, this field's not supposed to be blank. How many blanks do we have out of how many fields? Just simple things like that, right?
I like your pillars though, Tommy, because delivery, right? If you're not delivering in one of the core expectations, and there's a lot to deliver for reporting, right?
Right.
There's a lot to deliver. If you can't deliver, then it doesn't matter how much you communicate. It doesn't matter how quickly you respond. Your satisfaction is always going to be low, right? So if I need all four of those things to build trust in the organization, this, I think, starts to paint the picture of just how much more involved teams become or people become when delivering reporting. That if anything, you could take this podcast over the last 15 minutes and show it to your leadership and say,
as always,
there's a lot more here than you think is here, right? Because to Mike's point, the higher the quality of, even delivery, right? If we're delivering solutions where the business has to be able to visibly see, when data is in a place where it should be, is it being validated?
Yes.
What are we checking? Do we have metrics against that? Like that requires teams of people to build and sustain.
Yes.
That doesn't happen with a skeleton crew.
No.
Right.
Exactly right. And so then this is, again, when I talk to data science about companies, right, one of the things I talk about with data science things is the algorithms are as good as they're going to ever be. When you implement an algorithm, it is 100% the best it can be.
Right.
You can tweak the algorithm, you can increase it, you can slightly change it a little bit with machine learning, but like when you read articles around like where's the biggest bang for your buck, the biggest bang for your buck is to increase the quality of your data, right? So if you want better machine learning, the more effort you spend cleaning and creating higher quality data to go into that data algorithm, whatever that is, the better your results will be.
Actually, the more I'm thinking about this, because I was about to, what you both said, I think it literally just changed my mind in a second, but I was going to double down the data quality is the foundation here of the four pillars. But very interestingly so, like in baseball, like, or in any sports, usually like the what have you done for me lately? Like, do I trust this person to make a shot, or do I trust this person to make it like get a hit? But it doesn't matter if he had a hit, 3 weeks ago. I measure what he's doing now. And in the very same way, like data quality is a very fluid thing too, because the business changes. So you may have good data quality, but the delivery is very fluid and corresponding or correlated part of that. Because if you're delivering great, probably your data quality is going to be a part of that. But if you can't deliver, odds are your data quality is going to get stagnant or inaccurate, because hey, the sales team changes every quarter.
Yep.
So who's
Yeah.
responsible for that? And that's part of
And
the delivery.
the thing I think to keep in mind that's hard for some engineers or individual contributors on the back end to understand is um, delivery is one point of interaction with
Yes.
a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about the 100 things it takes to get that accurate piece of information to them. They don't care where it breaks down. All they know is it broke down.
Yep.
And
Correct.
and that is a real challenge, especially when building trust, because it's very easy to lose that, even though
Yep.
Yeah.
you could be, hey man, we were at 50% like of things. Now we're at 98. And they're like, I don't care. It's still failing. It's still
Right.
not a good thing.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a hard pill to swallow, or a good view to have, because it doesn't matter how hard you work if you're not delivering that end to end.
And I guarantee you, even if all of your data was 100% accurate and no one's responding to people's requests, they're not going to trust BI.
And hey,
I would agree with that, right?
Yeah.
But that's a different bucket to me.
And then I was even talking with Alex Dupler, I think from Microsoft. He was building a report that he had so part of this is providing like an SLA agreement around the data that's coming in the report. And in his report, he had a meter, a gauge that said how old has this data been since it's been refreshed, and had like a little green, yellow, red indicator bar, and it was at how many hours since the last refresh of that data.
Fact checking himself.
I thought it was a great idea. It was again, it's this level of like it's this high level of like transparent. Can I trust this data?
Hey, that's actually a really good. That's a good idea, because then you don't need to go business doesn't need to validate against, all the different pieces, or monitor things, or check if something failed. Like, they would just know
Here's the
have
gauge.
enough of a gauge in place that would understand whether or not something's green, yellow, or red.
It sits up at it sits somewhere on the report page, and it just indicates where it is. And then with that little gauge, it was indicating with, okay, if the report has been refreshed within 12 hours, it was green, right? The data is fresh enough that you can go use it. If it was in yellow, it said refresh was delayed, we're looking into it. And then there's a red section that said there's a problem, we're trying to fix the issue on the data. So there was a guarantee from the team making the data to the team consuming the data that if we are self-monitoring this thing, and I think that's a great example of when you're applying rules around the delivery. And I firmly believe when you get to these larger data sets, when you're talking the delivery of these data sets, it's very important that you indicate to the consumer where you're at, what is the expectation for this data. If I'm only going to refresh it once per week, that's the expectation. Indicate on the report somewhere when its last refresh date was and when it will be refreshed again, so people can clearly see and evaluate, okay, where are we at with this cycle? Oh, I can see it's refreshed. Because what I do when I go to a new Power BI environment, I go through and say, okay, they show me this workspace. I'm like, oh, look at all these reports. Oh my gosh, half of them are not even refreshing. And then I'll ask the question, do we even use these? And they're like, no, we don't use these anymore. Then why are they here? But it's that concept though. It's like I can clearly look at, me as the guy who comes into this, just looking at all the refresh times of all the data sets, and anything that is not regularly refreshing likely is not important anymore. And if no one's complaining about those data sets not being refreshed, is it even valuable to the organization? Turn it off, kill it, get it out of the workspace, put it somewhere else. Like, it may not be relevant anymore.
Do not underestimate the transparency too, because I would double down with Alex what he did, where even if a report has a gauge in the red, I guarantee if you polled people, do you trust this? They would say absolutely, because they know what the expectation is. Not like, is it?
That's a
And
clear
they know,
expectation.
right?
I'm
Yeah.
There's a
setting the
clear
bar and I'm
expectation,
telling you where I'm at to the bar.
even in his own,
And
yeah,
when things are failing too, right?
Yes.
right.
Like if you get out in front of
Yes.
failures,
Way better.
like
And
people,
that's part of the
like
communication, the
your anger
response.
level of people having to
Yeah.
go figure something out for themselves
Yes.
greatly dissipates,
Yes.
right? You're like,
So,
hey,
yeah.
things broke at a core level. You're not going to see this today, right? Then that can get communicated,
Yep.
and people are like, oh well, okay, I won't do
So
my analysis today.
Exactly.
You
Or
know,
I'll,
I mean, it's
Delta,
not a
wait.
good
I'll
thing,
wait till
but at least
noon.
they don't spend a bunch of their time. And
Yeah.
I think that's where people, including myself, get a little ruffled. Like when you start
right.
investing time and then you find something out, you're like,
Right.
man, you just wasted my time. you know?
Delta did a study of their social media team where when people would message them because like their flight got delayed or what's not, when people were unhappy, they would respond to those people in such a way they had a process where afterwards they would actually pull those people, and apparently they had this subset of people, the people who badmouth Delta online that got responded to had a higher trust in people than a random group of
Yeah.
people who have never done that. And so even when we are in a crisis, like we can't just say that's negative trust. Like and that's why there's those other pillars or this other part of this where it's our ability to respond. But I mean, if anything, that can grow it even stronger.
I do dig it. Well, we have burned through an entirely good hour of this thing. This was this could have been a 2-episoder, I think, on this one. There's a lot of aspects here that go around trusting data. I think this was really good. It helped me. I just like talking about these ideas with you guys. It's just good. It just helps me like think about other perspectives of this stuff and refines my ideas around these kind of topics. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for everyone who's been watching. We appreciate you guys engaging and talking with us on the chat. We appreciate you very much. Our only ask is if you like this content, subscribe, hit the bell. If you don't mind, send a message on the social medias. Hey, this was a good topic, relevant points, and maybe even tweet it out or throw it out on LinkedIn as well. We appreciate your feedback, and that really what's helps us drive and keep making more content like this. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
If you like the podcast and you're listening live, make sure to subscribe. This is our 119th episode, which means we've done 118 of very similar episodes, also hour long. So we have a full catalog for you to fall asleep or run or whatever you do on your normal day. If you are listening, guess what? We also do it live. So it's kind of like 100 or 238 episodes so that you can watch. Sure, the math checks out. But join the conversation live. And
we're not going to hold you on data quality for that answer there. We'll let that one slide, Tommy.
If I talk and then listen to it, that's like twice.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Awesome. Well, thank you all very much, and we'll see you on Thursday.